In the name of the one holy and living God. Amen. Please be seated. I am the bread of life. This gospel, we're getting it in three parts. We had one last week, one this week, and one next week. John's long discourse from Jesus on the bread of life. And I really hope you all were blessed to hear Maggie's sermon last week, which was masterful and rich and beautiful. And if you didn't, thanks to Ellen Vadney's faithful work, it was posted almost immediately on the Emmanuel website. So I really urge you to go and listen to it. And thank you, Ellen, for your endlessly faithful work. Maggie spoke of the ways in which, in fleeting moments, a word or a phrase or an image in liturgy or in the Bible or in the Book of Common Prayer can be a portal that suddenly flings open to a holy experience, a fleeting encounter, one that cannot be described, cannot be summoned, cannot be repeated. Words fail. I was with my beloved Claudia at the 8 o'clock service, and we were so moved by her sermon. Something very strange happened. Both of us were struck silent for the rest of the service. Something had happened that was a holy moment for both of us. And so we were happy to be there while the others prayed, but we were silent. When Maggie spoke about what we hunger for, it took me back 30 years to my initial and pivotal holy encounter. I rarely tell the story, and I hope you don't mind if I share it with you today. The time I was senior curator of the Dallas Museum of Art. Though I had been very, very active at Christ Church Cathedral, Houston, where I was baptized at 6 weeks old, confirmed, etc., right through school, when I went to college, I fell away. I majored in art history. I lucked into a museum job right out of college, an amazing job, and I was launched on this, what turned out to be an incredibly fortunate and blessed career in art, in the art museum world. And I'm always going to be grateful for that. Sadly, I wasn't just a lapsed Christian. I was an arrogantly insistent agnostic. Arrogantly insistent agnostic. I was good at my work and I was successful. My career was really my life, and it became a false god. I had loving parents and friends, so my emotional life was rich, and I had some nice beaux along the way, but I never married. I never let love for another person deflect me from my own agenda and my own career. Not proud of it, but that's the truth. In my early mid-40s, I had the kind of classic awakening, the midlife search for meaning that successful men have long written about, beginning with Dante's Divine Comedy, and more recently, people like David Brooks' The Second Mountain, or Richard Rohr's book, Falling Upward. I was baffled by this sense of emptiness and meaninglessness, and I turned, where would you turn? To self-help books. I haunted the self-help book section of Barnes & Noble, and one title summed up the way I felt. My life seems great. Why do I feel so awful? I mean, really, I had this great career, great friends. I had every opportunity, and I'd gotten to a place in my career where, it was really sort of, I never would have dreamt that I could get to that place. Another book that I was paying attention to, some of you may remember, Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. I see a few nods. Yeah, well, of course, I wanted to be a highly effective person, so I was reading that book, and I did all right with the first 6 habits, but then you get to the seventh. And the seventh habit of highly effective people, according to Stephen Covey, is, he calls it sharpening the saw. Highly effective people renew themselves regularly, intellectually by reading outside of their field, socially by being with people they love, and spiritually. Whoops, spiritually, okay. Well, I don't know if I was really effective, but I was efficient and driven. So when I saw that that was where I was deficient, I thought, okay, got to take care of this spiritual thing. Got to find a church, I guess. Now, the Episcopal Church was out of the question because in my defense and my agnosticism, I had built a wall around my heart. And I didn't believe in the virgin birth. And you had to say the creed, you had to say the virgin, talk about the virgin birth. So I thought, I can't go to the Episcopal Church. Now let's see, where could I go? Unitarians. Because as this wonderful wit, who was a great friend of the family growing up, said, when the Unitarians pray, they say, to whom it may concern. No creed. So another lapsed Episcopal friend and I made a date to go to the Unitarian Church, and it was all set, and the last minute she called and canceled. She had something come up. And I thought, well, you know, here I am, efficient, right, and driven, and I was dressed for church. It was on the calendar, I was going to go to church, but I didn't know where to start. So I called a friend who I thought might go to church, and I said, you know, you go to church? Are you going this morning? And she said, sure, I'll pick you up. I didn't ask where she was going. God is so good. Because, of course, we landed at St. Michael's and All Angels Episcopal Church in Dallas. Now, thank God it was right one, because I didn't know anything about the New Book of Common Prayer. And I'm sure that if it had been right too, I don't know what I would have done, maybe walked out and taken a taxi home. Because even though I didn't know anything about it, I rejected it on principle. A New Book of Common Prayer, absolutely not. So it was right one, and I knew the language. But I didn't like anything else, really, in the service. I was an art snob, which meant I was an architecture snob, and the architecture of the church was definitely, I was a church architecture snob, and it wasn't like this. It was kind of contemporary and not really great, in my opinion. And the sermon was middling, and the music wasn't wonderful, and, you know, there I was. I can't imagine the indifference that I was radiating, the energy. And then came the Eucharistic prayer. And I heard, this is my body given for you. And it pierced my heart. And the walls around my heart just dissolved. Now, there aren't words to describe. I can just tell you a little bit about how I felt. In that instant, it was an instant. I felt I was filled with grace, with God's grace, filled with love. I knew I was completely loved. I was completely accepted as I was. And I was forgiven, whatever that meant. That word came to me, and I was forgiven. The bread of life had come to fill my hunger for meaning. For weeks, I simply went back to St. Michael's every Sunday. I didn't want to talk to anyone. I did not want coffee, thank you. I did not want to get involved. I just wanted to worship and weep. And I have to remind myself of that, and I remind you, because that may happen to someone else who comes here. And we need to respect that. Because at this stage of my journey, it was a solitary adventure, and it had to be. It had to be. And it was also really kind of lonely, because none of my colleagues that I knew, and very, very few of my nearest and dearest, were people of faith. Who could I talk to about it? I mean, I wasn't going to share my story. That was over the edge, right? I mean, what Episcopalian has a conversion experience? We're the frozen chosen, we're orderly. But I did, of course, because my life had changed. I went to church every Sunday, no matter where I was. When I was traveling on business, and in those days, the fares were lower if you stayed over a Saturday night. You may remember, some of you are old enough to remember that. So I always stayed over a Saturday night. And I would just go to the Episcopal church that was closest to where I was spending the night, spending Saturday night. So I did, it became clear that I was going back to church. And people in my family and friends, had different reactions. Really? It's kind of odd. That's kind of strange, isn't it? They thought. Others were more skeptical than that, and even hostile or afraid. And in retrospect, I realized some of those people had erected the same defenses against the church that I had. And I think that some were afraid because, again, back then, the secular media had paid the image of Christians that the secular media had promoted were that we were all lunatics, right? We were all fundamentalist lunatics. And I think if you didn't know anybody who was in church, who was a faithful Christian, you might have that impression. I even had that impression. I was afraid when I went to seminary. I was that new of a Christian. No, so anyway, in time, people realized I wasn't going to drag them to church. I was still me. They accepted it. When I moved back to Houston for what would be my last museum job, I rejoined Christ Church Cathedral, and oh my goodness, speak about being home. Then I was really ready for community. I was engaged in all kinds of ministries. Oh, it was just so exciting and so wonderful. And my faith expanded and was nurtured, and finally came to the place where I realized I was called to the priesthood. And if some of you all have served on a discernment committee, you know that, of course, someone who feels called to the priesthood has to go through a series of steps in discernment. And the first one is in the parish. And naturally, you have to tell your faith story. So I did, and that's when I learned, I told my conversion story, that's when I learned that it could be hurtful. It could be hurtful to people who had been faithful members all their lives, and nothing like that had happened to them. And they wondered why. And I wondered why too, and I realized, well, that's what it took it's what it took to turn my life around. I had to be slammed. I had to get the 2x4. And that became my shorthand for telling the experience. I never had another dramatic encounter like that. Whew. I did learn, or have learned, sometimes I forget, to ask and listen for the still small voice. But as my faith has grown more and more, I see God's hand at work in the world around me, which is a line from our Eucharistic prayer. Fleeting encounters with the Holy can happen anytime. In worship, of course, as it did to me. But God is always present. And portals to feeling God's grace and mercy and blessing and goodness are everywhere, in nature, in acts of kindness, in music, in art. We just need to be open to that mystery, listening and seeing with the ears and the eyes of our hearts. Now, Claudia is much, much more attuned than I. And she gently helps me and others recognize holy moments. What she calls sometimes unusual encounters, unusual experiences. Things that we might shrug off or dismiss as just coincidence. Life is full of coincidences, which is God's way of working. And Claudia urges us all to talk about them. Looking back in my life, on my life now, I see God's guiding hand was there over and over again as I stumbled along. When we share these unusual experiences with one another, we name it and we honor God's abiding presence and care for all of us in all places and in all times. Bidden or unbidden, God is present. Some of you know that the pioneering psychoanalyst Carl Jung had those words written all over the door of his house in Switzerland. Bidden or unbidden, God is present. If we trust in that truth and gently speak of the ways that we recognize God's presence in various moments, we may help others begin to see God's blessing and presence in their lives as well as in the world around. It might even open a portal. We live in a period of cynicism, contention, and strife. God is always with us, inviting us in ways large and small to work with God for the good. We may doubt the signs. We may shy away in vulnerability, thinking of sharing them. But let's take the risk. Let's take the risk to see God here and now, to help awaken ourselves and others to that. It's a small, important way that we can help God transform the world, one holy moment at a time. Amen.